It started with the sound of snapping twigs, faint, deliberate, and unsettlingly close to the property line. The morning sun had just begun to spill over the roofs of the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the manicured lawns in soft gold. I stood by my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching a shadowy figure bend and stretch by the back fence. It didn't take long to recognize her, Karen, the self-proclaimed president of the HOA and self-appointed ruler of all things petty. For months, she had been at war with my backyard. It started small, a complaint about my bird feeder being too flashy, then a warning letter about my choice of lawn chairs not matching the neighborhood aesthetic. Every week seemed to bring a new rule she'd made up on the spot, as if she took personal offense at the idea of me enjoying my own property. The HOA, under her leadership, had turned from a neighborhood organization into a miniature dictatorship. Karen relished the power. She strutted through the community like she owned it, clipboard in hand, camera always ready to document violations. But nothing set her off quite like my fence. The fence had been standing for years, sturdy and weathered, built long before Karen had moved in. To her, it was an eyesore, to me, it was privacy. And that privacy was something she couldn't stand. She wanted control, and fences were boundaries she couldn't manipulate. A week earlier, I had caught her peeking through the slats, pretending to inspect for pests. I told her to stay off my property, but she only smirked and muttered something about community standards. I knew then it wouldn't end there. Now, as I watched her again, crouched near the fence line with a tape measure and a notebook, I felt the slow burn of frustration twist into something else, curiosity. What exactly was she doing? Later that day, an HOA notice appeared in my mailbox. The letter claimed my fence extended 6 inches beyond approved property limits, and may be subject to removal if not corrected immediately. I couldn't help but laugh. 6 inches, really? It was ridiculous, but that was Karen's style, turning the smallest thing into a full-blown crusade. I ignored the letter at first, assuming logic would eventually win. But Karen didn't operate on logic, she thrived on confrontation. Within days, she escalated. Anonymous notes appeared taped to my front door. HOA inspectors, really just her friends, began walking by my yard, snapping photos. Then came the rumor mill, whispers about me refusing to comply, about my yard being an eyesore. Every lie spread faster than the last, and Karen was always the one feeding them. But she didn't stop there. One evening, as dusk fell, I heard rustling again, louder this time, clumsy. I stepped out onto the back porch just in time to see a flashlight beam flick across the grass. My heart pounded. Someone was in my yard. I moved quietly toward the edge of the porch, and there she was, Karen, in her signature pink hoodie, half crouched by the fence with her phone camera out, snapping pictures of my garden beds. She didn't see me at first, too busy documenting whatever imaginary violation she'd cooked up. I stood there in disbelief, watching as she reached down and began to dig at the soil by the fence post, muttering to herself as if she were a detective uncovering buried treasure. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance anymore, this was obsession. The next morning, I installed motion-activated cameras along the fence. If Karen wanted to play detective, I'd let the evidence speak for itself. For the next few days, nothing happened, or so I thought. When I checked the footage later that week, my stomach dropped. There she was again, sneaking into my yard in the dead of night. She moved awkwardly, stepping over flower beds, ducking behind bushes whenever headlights passed by. At one point, she even tripped over my garden hose, falling flat on her face before scrambling up and limping away. I should have been angry, and I was, but part of me couldn't help finding it darkly funny. Karma, it seemed, was already starting to warm up. I printed out stills from the footage and sent them to the HOA board with a polite note asking them to remind the president that trespassing is illegal. I expected silence. Instead, I got a smug reply stating that board members are permitted to inspect properties when violations are suspected. Unbelievable. But fine. If Karen wanted to play games, I was done playing defense. I decided to clean up the yard, fix a few lights, and make sure everything was perfectly in order. I wanted her to have nothing, no excuse, no violation, no reason to meddle. My yard was flawless, compliant with every rule she'd ever thrown at me. And that's when I set the trap. I adjusted one of the motion lights so it pointed directly toward the area she always crept through, right near the fence post she'd been measuring. I replaced the ordinary light bulb with a high-lumen floodlight that could turn night into day. Then I set the motion camera to record in full HD. For 2 nights, nothing happened. But on the third night, around 2 a.m., the camera caught everything. The footage began with Karen's familiar figure approaching the fence line, flashlight in hand. She looked around cautiously, then climbed over the fence, awkwardly, struggling halfway through before falling into my yard with a soft thud. She stood up, brushed herself off, and began walking toward the flower bed again. Then the light came on. A blinding white flood illuminated the entire yard. Karen froze like a deer caught in headlights, shielding her face. The camera caught every detail, the shock, the guilt, the frantic attempt to run. But in her panic, she tripped over the same garden hose again, landing flat in a patch of mud. The next morning, I had my proof, crystal clear. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Because while I thought I'd finally caught her red-handed, Karen was about to take her obsession to a whole new level, and the fallout would shake the entire HOA. The footage of Karen falling face-first into the mud should have been the end of it. I thought common sense, embarrassment, or at least the sheer humiliation of being caught trespassing would make her back down. But I underestimated her ego, and the lengths she'd go to maintain her illusion of control. The next morning, she was at my doorstep. Not to apologize, but to accuse. According to her, my surveillance setup violated HOA privacy guidelines. She claimed I was spying on neighbors, twisting the situation so skillfully you'd almost believe she was the victim. Her tone was sugar-coated but sharp underneath, the kind of voice that smiled while it drew blood. I didn't bother engaging. Instead, I handed her a printed copy of the trespassing footage and closed the door. For a moment, it felt satisfying, the final word in a months-long battle. But I should have known, Karen didn't lose gracefully. She retaliated in the only way she knew how, through the HOA. 2 days later, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox. Notice of violation. My heart sank as I unfolded the letter. It listed a string of absurd accusations: unapproved exterior lighting, unauthorized recording devices, non-compliant lawn ornamentation. Each one was a fabricated attempt to fine or harass me. At the bottom, in bold print, was a warning: failure to comply may result in property inspection and additional penalties. It was her revenge, bureaucratic and venomous. Within a week, the HOA board, clearly acting under Karen's direction, scheduled a mandatory inspection. They claimed it was routine, but everyone knew it was personal. Karen even had the nerve to show up with a clipboard and a smug smile, surrounded by 2 of her loyal committee members. They strutted through my yard like it was a courtroom, pointing at random things and jotting notes, pretending to find problems that didn't exist. I stayed calm. The cameras recorded everything. I said nothing, did nothing, and waited. The truth had a way of surfacing, and I had more patience than Karen had self-control. That patience paid off sooner than expected. A few days later, a storm rolled through the neighborhood. Rain poured for hours, soaking the lawns and flooding the gutters. The next morning, I noticed something unusual: the section of fence that bordered Karen's property looked different. Part of it was leaning, warped slightly at the base. I went to check, and that's when I saw it. A shallow trench ran along the bottom of the fence line, half filled with rainwater and mud. It looked freshly dug. Someone had clearly been tampering with the posts. My first thought was disbelief: could Karen really have tried to sabotage the fence just to prove a point? But then I remembered the footage, the late-night digging, the obsession. The answer was obvious. I didn't fill the trench. Instead, I documented it. Photos, videos, timestamps, all of it. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd let her dig her own hole, literally. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I heard shouting from next door. Karen's backyard had flooded. Her carefully manicured garden beds were underwater, the mulch floating away like little rafts. Apparently, the rainwater had pooled where she'd dug along the fence, turning her prized rose garden into a swamp. It was poetic. Karma, again, proving she didn't miss. But Karen wasn't laughing. From my window, I could see her pacing back and forth, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly toward my yard. Within the hour, 2 HOA board members showed up, umbrellas in hand, inspecting the mess. Karen pointed, yelled, waved papers, trying to convince them I'd somehow caused the flood. This time, though, things didn't go her way. One of the board members, a quiet older gentleman named Mr. Lawson, crouched near the trench and frowned. He'd been around long enough to recognize what had really happened. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Karen's face go pale as he pointed to the disturbed soil and shook his head. The next day, I received an email, not from Karen, but from the HOA's secretary. It was short and apologetic. The recent inspection results have been voided. We'll be reviewing the situation internally. It wasn't just a victory, it was the first crack in Karen's armor. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who'd once been afraid to cross her started whispering about her overreach. People remembered their own run-ins with her, the fines, the intimidation, the endless inspections. She'd built her power on fear, but now, with that fear slipping, the illusion began to crumble. Still, Karen wasn't done. She doubled down, calling emergency board meetings, sending mass emails about neighborhood safety concerns, and insisting that homeowners needed to reevaluate security systems. It was clear she was trying to discredit me publicly, painting me as a troublemaker who spied on neighbors and ignored HOA policies. The problem was, the cameras, the same ones she tried to get me fined for, had captured every bit of her trespassing, her late-night visits, and even the trench by the fence. I wasn't the one exposed, she was. That weekend, I was invited to an HOA meeting. It was unusual, I wasn't on the board, but the email said attendance was strongly recommended. Something was brewing. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the front, her usual confidence brittle, her smile forced. The board members exchanged uneasy glances as residents filled the chairs. It felt less like a meeting and more like a trial. The first half was routine business, budgets, landscaping, trash pickup. But then, the conversation shifted. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat and mentioned recent allegations regarding trespassing and misuse of authority. All eyes turned to Karen. Her smile faltered. Someone from the audience, Mrs. Dorsey from down the street, spoke up about how Karen had entered her backyard without permission last summer. Then another neighbor mentioned finding her near their garage at night, claiming she was checking for code violations. One by one, people began sharing their own stories. Karen tried to talk over them, to control the narrative, but the room had turned. Her voice wavered as the accusations piled up, each one more damning than the last. And then, at the perfect moment, I stood and spoke, calm, measured, and precise. I described what had happened at my property and then mentioned the footage. The room went silent. Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked nervous. Mr. Lawson asked if I would be willing to share the video with the board for review. I nodded. Karen stammered, saying something about privacy and misunderstandings, but the damage was done. The board adjourned the meeting early, announcing an internal review into her conduct as HOA president. As people filed out, I caught sight of Karen lingering by the door, her face pale and drawn. The confidence she'd worn like armor was cracking, and beneath it was pure panic. That night, for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more midnight inspections. No more petty notes or fake violations. Just silence, heavy, waiting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. And if the storm had only shaken her grip on power, the next one was going to break it completely. The week after the HOA meeting was unusually quiet. No new letters appeared in my mailbox. No one came by to inspect the yard. Even Karen's usual patrols, the daily walks she used to take around the neighborhood with her clipboard and camera, had stopped. It was as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For a few days, I let myself believe it was finally over, that Karen had been humbled, that the board's internal review had stripped her of her authority, or at least scared her into silence. But people like her don't fade quietly. They cling to power until the very last thread snaps. And when it does, they go down swinging. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. On the fourth evening after the meeting, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, my phone buzzed with a notification, motion detected in the backyard. My stomach tightened. I opened the camera feed. There she was again. Karen, in the same pink hoodie, sneaking through the side gate like a shadow. Her movements were frantic, desperate. This time, she wasn't holding a clipboard, she was carrying a small shovel and what looked like a trash bag. I couldn't believe it. After everything, after being publicly exposed and nearly removed from the board, she was back in my yard that I watched, stunned, as she crouched by the same section of fence, the one she'd dug around weeks earlier. Her hands moved quickly, pulling at the dirt, shoving something into the small trench. She was planting evidence, I realized, trying to fabricate violations to frame me one last time. But karma doesn't miss twice. As she worked, the floodlight burst to life, brighter than ever. She froze, just like before, eyes wide, caked in mud and guilt. For a second, she looked straight into the camera, and that's when her foot slipped. The ground was still damp from last night's rain, and the trench she'd dug had turned slick with mud. She lost her balance, fell backward, and landed directly in the patch of thorny cacti I'd planted last month to keep raccoons away. Her scream shattered the quiet night. By the time I stepped outside, she was struggling to get up, covered in scratches, her pink hoodie torn, and one shoe missing. The bag she'd been holding had burst open, spilling out what looked like weeds and scraps of paper she'd intended to scatter around my garden to make it look unkempt. She was caught. Again. Only this time, there was no denying what she'd been doing. She tried to stammer something about checking property lines, but I didn't say a word. I simply pointed to the camera, still recording, and told her the police were already on their way. It wasn't true, not yet, but the fear in her eyes said it all. She scrambled to her feet, limped toward the fence, and climbed over it as fast as she could, leaving her shovel and the torn remains of her pride behind. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private link and sent it directly to the HOA board, subject line, repeat offense, immediate review requested. Within 24 hours, everything changed. The HOA called an emergency session. Karen wasn't invited, but word spread fast. Neighbors who'd once avoided the drama now gathered outside the clubhouse, whispering, waiting. When the meeting ended, the announcement came through the neighborhood email chain. Effective immediately, Karen L. has been removed from her position as HOA president due to multiple violations of community conduct and trespassing policies. The relief that followed was almost tangible. People smiled again. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about noise violations. The neighborhood, once tense and divided under Karen's rule, slowly began to feel like a community again. A few weeks later, Karen's house went up for sale. The rumors varied, some said the board forced her out, others claimed she couldn't handle the humiliation. Whatever the truth, by the end of the month, her house was empty. The pink lawn decorations she'd once fined others for not matching HOA color codes now lay discarded by the curb. The irony was delicious. life settled back into its rhythm. My fence stood tall, untouched. The cameras stayed up, though they didn't catch much anymore, just squirrels, the occasional stray cat, and the gentle sway of trees in the wind. But sometimes, late at night, when I sat out on the porch with a cup of tea, I'd glance toward that empty house next door and think about how it all began, one small act of control, one petty complaint, spiraling into obsession and downfall. Karen had believed she could control everyone around her. She'd used fear, rules, and fake authority to bend the neighborhood to her will. But in the end, it was her own paranoia that destroyed her, her refusal to let go, her need to prove she was right, even when everyone else could see she was wrong. That's the thing about people like her, they dig so hard into other people's lives, they never realize they're burying themselves. Weeks passed, then months. The HOA appointed a new president, Mr. Lawson. Fair, reasonable, and actually neighborly. The tone of every meeting changed. Instead of policing, they started helping, organizing block parties, cleanups, and small community gatherings. The laughter that had once been replaced by gossip returned to the streets. And though no one mentioned Karen by name anymore, her story lived on quietly, a cautionary tale passed from one neighbor to the next. Whenever someone got a little too nosy or bossy about rules, someone would smirk and say, "Careful, don't go full Karen." It became an inside joke, a reminder of what had been and what we'd all overcome. For me, it was closure. My yard was finally my own again, peaceful, untouched, and private, just as it should have been all along. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the trees whispered against the fence, I'd almost imagine. It became an inside joke, a reminder of what had been and what we'd all overcome. For me, it was closure. My yard was finally my own again, peaceful, untouched, and private, just as it should have been all along. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the trees whispered against the fence, I'd almost imagine hearing her voice again, faint, distant, complaining about property lines. Then I'd smile, sip my tea, and whisper back into the night. "Not this time, Karen." Because in the end, karma always catches up, and when it does, it never misses.